This is the third devlog for a game I've been working on, built around rocket jumping, and the community-made jump maps of Team Fortress 2. While it's recommended you watch the previous devlogs for the full context of what I'm aiming for with this project, it will be less important here since I won't be going too deep into game mechanics like I did in the previous videos, though I'll get into that a bit at the end. Over the past several months, I've done a bit of work on refining gameplay, but a lot of my focus has been on how exactly I'll be making levels and what those levels will look like, and I'm now ready to show that work. So let's get into that. Before starting work on this game, I had barely touched 3D game development in any capacity, so I knew that I would eventually have to learn the basics like modeling and UV mapping. The first 3D model I had ever made in my life without strictly following a tutorial was the rocket launcher shown in the second devlog, which was a good test run for me to learn simple modeling in Blender, but I didn't need to touch any remotely complex texturing methods for that or the rockets, which is what I would need to do for at least one level. While I have another way of making levels without Blender that I'll get into later, I wanted to make a hub area that you can physically walk around before getting into actual levels, and for my concept, I would need Blender's flexibility to create relatively complex shapes. I decided way back when I picked this bright sunny skybox that the hub area and the first beginner map should be pleasant and inviting in its visuals, and taking inspiration from Minecraft's impossible floating structures and the classic skyblock map, as well as the third area in Fury and the early levels from the Super Monkey Ball games, I chose this sunny aesthetic with natural, brightly colored floating islands in the sky. I started by making this fairly simple outline of what the general collision would look like, and from that, a visual outline with solid colors followed naturally. After that, UVs proved to be relatively simple for my purposes, and with a bit of help, I had an effective workflow established for getting the model into the game. But the first major decision here that would decide the look of the rest of the game would be what style I would pick for the textures. In the footage of previous versions shown in the previous devlogs, you could probably tell that I was gravitating towards a low-poly, retro-ish visual style from the beginning, since I was already rendering the game at a lower resolution to achieve the pixelated look. The checkerboard dev textures were chiefly made so that they would clearly show how fast the player is moving at any given time, but I made sure that every form of texture compression and interpolation was turned off so that they would appear pixel perfect. Though I wasn't gravitating towards this sort of aesthetic just because of my lack of experience with 3D visual design, because I also knew that the game would work better if level geometry was kept to a minimal polygon count with very simple shapes. When it comes to games like this, where the movement feels better when it's as consistent as possible, collision models with high polygon counts will only serve to make movement less consistent through constantly changing slopes and little bumps in the ground completely stopping movement. While exact collisions can still be achieved through creating secondary low-poly collision models, that sacrifices visual clarity that you can only get by having visuals that match the collision models exactly, and since this low-poly, low-res look will make my time commitment for designing visuals minimal as well, it seems like the best path to take for this project. With this in mind, I was able to make very simple low-res textures using Blender's procedural brick texture, which with the right parameters can essentially create noise textures of various colors. I used this for the grass and dirt beneath the island, with the flower bed around the edge of the model being a low-resolution flower field texture with a shifted hue. It's important to note that like everything in these early devlogs, this is all subject to change, but I'm still quite happy with how the hub model looks right now. I could definitely add textures to some of the parts that are currently just solid color textures, but there's still time for me to get better at UV mapping and texture creation as I continue development, so I'm happy to leave it looking like this for now. Now I had this floating island hub area, but it still felt like something was missing. I found that everything felt very static, and I wanted to introduce a bit of inherent motion to make the environment feel as lively as the bright lighting and colors imply. So I made a system for specific ambient particle effects to appear over time in maps, and for the hub and what will eventually be the tutorials and beginner map, I made this particle effect inspired by the cartoon wind lines seen in games like Wind Waker. For now, their movement is very simple, always moving in the same direction at the same speed, though that's something that absolutely might change when I get into making that first map. You may have also noticed that the game is being rendered at a higher resolution compared to footage I've previously released, which is the result of a new system I have that can render the HUD at full resolution while rendering all the 3D elements at a lower resolution. This should let me implement an option to increase or decrease the 3D resolution once I get to implementing those options, But for now, I've found that half resolution is a good middle ground for keeping the retro aesthetic while increasing visibility. Another visual bug that got fixed along the way is that the rocket launcher is now properly lit by lights in the environment, which looks a lot more natural than the nearly unshaded look it had previously. That's all the work I've done on the visuals, so now let's talk about tutorials. The first question for the rest of the levels is how exactly I would go about making them, and I have a method that has some useful upsides compared to making all the geometry in Blender. I'm currently using Godot as the engine for this game, and while Godot has relatively weak built-in tools for prototyping with CSGs, as I discovered while making slopes for the test map, there's a plugin called Quado which allows you to import brush-based geometry from quake.map files. For this project, Quado isn't just good for prototyping levels in the early stages of development because, since I want my level geometry to be simple for the sake of consistent movement, I can actually use it to make entire chunks of level geometry outright for the final versions of maps. Additionally, Quado allows for creating brush entities that represent different types of collision, like illusory brushes that have no collision, which I used for the flower beds, or more importantly, for certain parts of levels that delete rockets on collision. I can still make some sections of geometry in Blender in case I want something a bit more complex for aesthetic reasons, but I expect I'll be using Quado to make much of the playable level geometry for the game. But let's talk about tutorial design now. While I have mockups for the tutorial levels to show, a full view of my concept for the tutorials is not something I'll have ready for a while. When I was making the top, I was able to include a somewhat silent tutorial that only explicitly stated button prompts for controls, while leaving the rest of the mechanics for the level design to subtly push the player towards discovering. As much as I would love to do this sort of tutorial for this game, I have to look forward to when I'll eventually need to teach the more complex mechanics like air strafing or sync jumps. These are mechanics that new players won't just be able to figure out on their own when only given prompts for controls, which is why groups like Jump Academy exist for TF2. Teaching many of these advanced techniques to absolute beginners requires a more direct approach than the elegant silent tutorial allows for, whether that teaching is done through video tutorials or being directly coached by another player. While this is unfortunate, I still have a solid plan for how I'll eventually implement tutorials, and for this I'll again be stealing an approach from another game called Hyperdemon. Hyperdemon has a set of tutorials that teach important concepts about the game's otherwise obtuse enemy designs, and before just giving the player the list of actions they need to perform to complete the tutorial, it shows a replay of those actions being performed. This is also reminiscent of how Celeste's Chapter 9 goes about teaching wave dashing, another mechanic that is difficult to intuit and requires specific instruction to teach. I always knew that replays would be an important feature in this game, and I can use them for more than just sharing the best times of players on full maps, since they can also be used to explicitly show what these advanced techniques look like when properly performed for use in tutorials. This unfortunately means that I can't fully complete the design for the set of beginner tutorials until I implement replays, but since I have the required tools to make level geometry at this point, here's what I have for the level design so far. The first tutorial starts with the very simple basics before even introducing the rocket launcher. All you have to do is jump over a couple obstacles and slide under a low ceiling, but this level should help establish the basic physics and rules the game plays by in the simplest possible controlled environment. The second tutorial introduces the rocket launcher and only requires rockets to be shot straight down at the player's feet to get across these gaps, which is what I would call the simplest possible type of jump. The third and final tutorial is about walls, both jumping straight up against a wall and using a wall to extend a jump horizontally. My hope is that these 3 tutorials will confer all the requisite experience to make it through the beginner map, which means that I'm going to attempt to design the beginner map assuming that players will not know how to airstrafe. This will be a limiting factor on the level design, but I think it's important for this first level to be as simple as possible for the sake of constructing a smooth difficulty curve for new players, and obviously there will be opportunities for shortcuts by coming back with knowledge of airstrafing and other advanced techniques. But before finishing up, I've prepared yet another mechanical change to sliding. Sliding has been the most difficult design problem for the project so far, since it's not something that's seen in this exact form in any of the games I'm pulling from. I know I've been focusing on it a lot in these devlogs, but I think I'm nearing a final implementation at this point, so hopefully you won't have to hear about it in detail again. The change I've made this time is to allow the firing of rockets at any point in the slide, but only if you buffer the slide from the air. Put more simply, if you press slide just before you land on the ground, in just the same way that you can buffer a perfect bunny hop in the air, the cooldown where you can't fire rockets is skipped. I came up with this because I was dissatisfied with only bypassing the fire cooldown when on slopes, as is necessitated by the new way I handle sliding on slopes. This new method keeps sliding from invalidating bunny hopping, while allowing players to fire rockets out of a slide if they have a good enough sense of timing to hit the perfect slides. This will obviously be tutorialized along with sliding on slopes later on, since it will be necessary to hit a perfect slide to hit high-speed jumps off slopes. Another benefit of the slide that I've neglected to mention in these videos thus far is how sliding improves on what's called a speed shot in TF2, which is a tick-perfect technique where you get hit by a rocket on the same tick you touch the ground. The game will only clamp your speed if you jump on the same tick you land, but it doesn't clamp your speed if you hit yourself with a rocket on that same tick. This new sliding implementation also helps to streamline this part of TF2 jumping, since you can hit a perfect slide and immediately shoot a rocket at your feet to replicate the speed shot from TF2 without requiring the same degree of precision. Hopefully this will have been the last time I'll be talking about sliding in depth in these devlogs, but it's possible I'll need to make big changes once I start designing full maps. So that's all the work I've done since the last devlog, and there are a few different paths I could take for my next milestone, and thus the topic for the next devlog. One thing I definitely want to have done is the logic for level design, like the pieces of geometry that delete rockets and other level design building blocks like that. But on top of that, I also want one of these three things implemented: UI for entering tutorials and levels from the hub area, replays, or the first beginner map. I'm leaning towards working on replays at the moment, but that could change if I end up wanting to put off that work. The fourth devlog will almost certainly not be the next video I upload, since I have another big project for the channel that will take a lot of my time over the next month, but if you want to keep up with development regardless, subscribing to the channel is the best way to do it. That's all I have to show for today, but hopefully I'll have more to show you soon.